Today we are going to look at classification, and classification is all about really similarities and differences between different organisms, different species. One of the first people to try and categorize living things into groups and give them names was this chap called Carl Linnaeus, and there's a picture of him there. He's the one at the top. And he was around in the 1700s, and he was a Swedish scientist, and he tried to put all living things into different categories. So if you imagine being around in the 1700s when Carl Linnaeus was trying to categorize all living things into different groups, have a little think about what he would have done, how he would have gone about this. So his main way was to simply go by what they looked like. So he could tell that a tiger was very different to a tree. It'd be quite dangerous if you couldn't tell the difference, really, wouldn't it? So if you think about the obvious ways that he could have divided up all living things, the most obvious thing you can do is you can split them in two, and you can say that some living things are animals and some living things are plants. Okay? And then once we've done that, what he did was he started trying to divide them into smaller and smaller groups. So you can imagine once you've decided that you've got the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, you can look at the animal kingdom and you can quite easily split this down into groups within the animal kingdom. So birds and mammals are both types of animal, but they're obviously very different things. And he kept dividing it down and separating out different living things into smaller and smaller groups until finally he ended up with every different type of living thing in its own group. And the last two groups that any living thing belongs to, the genus and the species, these give each living thing what we call its binomial name. And binomial just means two names. Okay, so bi means two, nomial means name. So if you have a look on the right there, we've got an elephant, and obviously an elephant is in the animal kingdom, and then you can narrow that down into smaller and smaller categories. So the elephant belongs to a group within the animal kingdom that has a spinal cord. They also have hair as opposed to feathers or anything else like that. They have a long muscular nose, long tusks. They have large ears. So all elephants belong to a genus, which is just a group, called Loxodonta. And within that genus of Loxodonta, there are several different species of elephant, and the Africana, or African elephant, is just one of several different species of elephant. So that means that the binomial name for the African elephant would be Loxodonta africana. Okay, so in this diagram here we can see some of the other levels of classification. So at the top there you've got kingdoms, and that is the animal kingdom. There's some examples of all different types of animal. You've got pandas, bears, Albert squirrel. I think that's a type of squirrel called the Albert squirrel, not Albert the squirrel. Well, that would be a good name for a squirrel. And then below the kingdom of animals, we've got the phylum Chordata, okay, which simply means, there's a lot of Latin unfortunately in this type of science. That simply broadly means that they are animals with a backbone. They're vertebrates, although that's not always true, but mostly true. And then below that, we've got a class of animals called mammals. And mammals, generally speaking, they give birth to live young. So in order to be a mammal, you must have fitted into all of those categories. You must be in the animal kingdom, you must be a vertebrate, and you must give birth to live young. And then below that we can separate the mammals into carnivores, and carnivores are animals that eat meat. And we can keep filtering it all the way down until we get to the genus Ursus, which is the genus of bears. Okay, so every species of bear is in the genus Ursus, and then we can separate it into the individual species of different bears. And there we've got one with the binomial name Ursus arctos, and that is the grizzly bear. Okay, so here is a very similar diagram showing the different levels of classification. We've got animal kingdom again. We've got Chordata, which we know is mostly vertebrates or animals with a backbone. We've got mammals, we've got carnivores, and at the bottom there you can see we've got down to a genus which is called Canis. And the Canis genus of living things contains things like wolves, coyotes, and modern day dogs. So if you have a dog yourself, your dog is in the Canis family. So there's two members of the Canis family. On the left, we've got the coyote, and the correct Latin name for the coyote, its species name, is latrans. And on the right, we've got a grey wolf, and the Latin name for the species grey wolf is lupus. Remember that our binomial name takes the first part of the two names from the genus, and the second part comes from the species name. So your first two questions for today is, I'd like you to write in the box below this video. It'll be called question 4, even though it's our first question, because you've put your name, surname and class in. So question 4 is our first question. I'd like you to write down in that box the binomial name for the coyote, and in the next question after that, I'd like you to write down the binomial name of the grey wolf. Remember, you need two names, genus name and species name for each. So pause for a minute, scroll down to the questions, put in your two answers, and then press play. Okay, take a quick look at these two chaps here. So I would think you'd probably agree with me that they look pretty similar. And if I asked you if these animals are closely related, you would probably agree with me, but you'd be wrong. In fact, they're not actually very closely related at all. The guy on the left there is actually a short-beaked echidna, and the one on the right was a European hedgehog, which you probably see in your garden sometimes. It turns out actually they're not particularly closely related at all. So the echidna is actually found in Australia, and obviously the European hedgehog, clues in the name, mostly found in Europe. And these two different species of animal had actually evolved completely independently from each other. They weren't closely related at all, but because they had evolved in a very similar way, they ended up looking almost identical, and that caused them to be classified as two different species from the same genus. But it turns out that isn't actually correct. They had actually evolved completely independently from each other. They had both just evolved in a very similar way and ended up looking very similar to each other. And this is one of the problems with classifying living things, or has been up until the discovery of DNA, in that we really had to just go on what they looked like. So if two animals looked very similar, we would just assume that they must be closely related. These days we can look at their DNA and you can actually work out how closely related they are depending on how similar their DNA is. So there are problems with relying on just what an animal looks like to try and classify it into the correct category. So you might want to remember that. You never know, you might get a question a bit later on about the difficulties of classifying living things. So it's been quite a long time since Carl Linnaeus was around in the 1700s, dividing things into the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. And since then, things got a little bit more sophisticated. We've got a little bit more knowledge of how things work. And now, in modern times, we organise living things into 5 kingdoms. We have the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom still, but we also have fungi, protists, and prokaryotes. So what I'd like you to do in your book, you'll have to pause here for a minute, but I want you to try and make a table, just like the one that's on the screen really, with the 5 kingdoms down one side and a space for an example of each, and then enough space that you can make some notes about the characteristics of each of those 5 different kingdoms. Okay, so pause whilst you do that and then press play when you're ready. Right, so we're going to talk through each of those 5 different kingdoms. We'll talk about an example for each, and we'll use what's on the screen there. We won't write all of that down because it's quite a lot of writing. We'll try and pick out the important points there and make some notes on the characteristics of each. So the first one is the animal kingdom. Now, I'm sure you don't need me to give you an example of an animal for the animal kingdom. So pick any animal you like and put that as your example for the animal kingdom. The first main characteristic of the animal kingdom is that all animals are multicellular, which simply means they have lots and lots of different cells. So our cells, we are obviously part of the animal kingdom ourselves, and we are made up of lots of different types of tissue, different organs. We are complex living things. We also have a nucleus in each of our cells, and our cells do not have cell walls. So any living thing that meets those three characteristics would be classed as an animal. So just to recap, in your characteristics you want multicellular, has a nucleus, and no cell wall. So the next one is plants, the plant kingdom. And again, I'm sure you can think of any plant that you can name, you can put as your example of a plant. And if we look at our main characteristics again, let's try not to write all of that. Let's try and bullet point it. So the first one is they are multicellular. So plants are made of lots of different types of cell. They all have chloroplasts because plants photosynthesize. So they contain chloroplasts, which animals don't. And their cells have a cell wall, which animals don't. So you can put 3 bullet points for that. Multicellular, has chloroplasts for photosynthesis, and has cell walls. Okay, on to our third one. The third kingdom is the fungi kingdom. There's a joke about that, but I won't make it. Okay, so the 3 main characteristics we need to bullet point on our table for the kingdom of fungi are that they are multicellular. They're made of lots of different cells. They live in or on dead matter, which they feed on. Nice. All of their cells have a nucleus, and they have cell walls, but they're not made of cellulose like plant cells are. They're made of a chemical called chitin, but you don't need to write that down. Okay, so just put down multicellular, live or feed on dead things, have a nucleus, and they have a cell wall. That's 4 things actually, isn't it? Put 4 things down. You can probably think of an example of a living thing that falls into the kingdom fungi. I'll give you a clue. You can eat one with your fried breakfast. Okay, so the 4th kingdom we're going to talk about is the protists. Okay, so the protists. So you probably can't think of an example of a protist off the top of your head. In fact, the protist kingdom is made up of all manner of unpronounceable living things, but one of the more widely known ones that you probably have heard of is algae. So an algae is an example of a protist. That's ALGAE. And protists have one very important difference to everything else we've talked about so far, and that is that they are unicellular. So uni means one. So if you're unicellular, you're not made up of lots of different cells, you're actually made up of one cell. Okay, there are a few examples that are multicellular, but mostly protists are single-celled living organisms. Okay, they also have a nucleus, and some have a cell wall. So 3 bullet points for that. They are unicellular, they have a nucleus, and they have a cell wall, or some have a cell wall. The last kingdom is the prokaryotes, and these are also unicellular, but the difference here is they do not have a nucleus inside their cells. Their DNA is actually loose inside the cell, it's not contained in a nucleus, and they also have a flexible cell wall. And an example of a prokaryote that you've definitely heard of is a bacteria, so you can write down bacteria for your example. Okay, so we've got some questions now for you. The first one's going to test whether you were listening earlier on. This is going to go in box 6 underneath this video. I want you to write down for me the binomial names. So it'll have 2 parts, a genus name and a species name. A binomial name for the African elephant. So put that into box 6 below the video. And the next question that will go in box 7. So green seaweeds do not have cellulose cell walls, but they do photosynthesize. So the first part of this question is for you to suggest why seaweeds were once thought to be plants. Maybe you still think they're plants. Seaweeds are actually not plants, but why did we used to think that seaweeds were plants based on that information? So put that into the next box below the video, and then see if you can give a reason why we now do not classify seaweeds as plants. Think back to the table we just filled in, There's a clue in the question itself. So seaweeds do not have a cellulose cell wall, but they do photosynthesize. Why do we now not classify them as plants? So you can add your answer below the video for that as well. And the last question here, in the 1970s, scientists found examples of a new group of single-celled organisms. Which kingdom would you put these in? Okay, so the last thing I'm going to get you to do is we're going to try and bring together what we talked about, and I'm going to get you to answer the last few questions on the form below the video. These questions are taken from past GCSEs, so these are real GCSE questions from previous years. They're the same sort of questions that you would get on an end of topic test as well, so it's really good to be able to answer these questions. All of the questions at the end you can answer based on what we've talked about and what we looked at during this video. The very last question, the 6-mark question, you'll need some information that we've talked about and looked at in the video. You'll also probably need to go off and do a little bit of independent research. You might want to look something up on the internet. That is the Warwick Star, that's the extension. You don't have to answer the last question, but I would strongly encourage you to have a go and see how you can do on that 6-mark question. Okay, so when you've done your questions, you can submit your form, and as always, drop me an email if you've got any problems. Well done, and I will speak to you soon.